So welcome again, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the coffee break, and now it's time to get to the very core of things, of this year's CyCon also, because this panel now is perhaps the most thematic when we look at the theme of this year's CyCon. The panel is titled Critical Internet Infrastructure and IoT-Enabled Attacks, and it is led by Ms. Ellen Nakashima, who is a national security reporter for the Washington Post. Among her interests and areas of coverage are topics such as cyber intelligence, cyber law, and international relations in the context of cyber. And also, she is one of the winners of 2014's Pulitzer Prize. So welcome, and thank you, Ellen, for moderating.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to CCDCOE for hosting this conference. So I was recently talking to a very smart internet scientist named Andrew Sullivan, who said too many people think the internet is the web. It's not. It's your smartphone, your Fitbit, increasingly your car. The internet is just how connections are made these days. And the Internet of Things is just more stuff on the internet. But Andrew also said that not all things on the internet are created equal. We've got baby monitors and webcams. We also have industrial control systems and some military applications. The former you might call low-value things, and the latter high-value things. All told, by some estimates, there are more than 8 billion devices connected in some way to the internet. And last October, more than 100,000 of these devices of the low-value variety were infected with malware, creating a zombie botnet army that attacked Dyne, one of the world's largest DNS providers. The attack barraged Dyne with traffic, blocking access intermittently to large numbers of users in North America and Europe who are seeking to get access to commercial sites like PayPal, Amazon, and Twitter. It wasn't the largest denial of service attack ever. It was just one of the more prominent. But the Mirai botnet gave the world a glimpse of how vulnerabilities in common household devices can be exploited to disrupt businesses and slow the internet to a crawl. Still, Mirai might not be the sort of thing we should worry about. We are at the early stages of IoT. The technology will shift towards higher value embedded devices, things like sensors and actuators that will be scattered throughout highways, airports, and hospitals to gather information and eventually to control physical infrastructure. What's coming with IoT, some say, is a transformation of the internet from a network that primarily connects humans and controls information to a network that in large measure connects machines and controls the physical world. But just how potentially dangerous is this trend? Is IoT too facile a phrase? Are there important distinctions to be made between botnets of low-value devices and targeted attacks on or through higher-value devices? Today, we are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts to help us think through these questions and debate their implications. They may not always agree, but it is in this healthy tension of ideas that we might find some insights that can help guide us to potential solutions. So briefly, because you already have their bios, I'll introduce the panelists. To my immediate left is Sandro Gaycken, Director of the Digital Society Institute at ESMT Berlin, and a consultant for the German Bundestag and international organizations such as the European Union and NATO. His research focuses on cyber strategy, cyber defense, and cybersecurity, and he is a hacker for hire. That is, he helps companies with pen testing to find vulnerabilities. Next to him is Dennis Broeders, a professor of technology and society at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam and a senior research fellow at the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy. His research addresses the interaction between technology and policy with a specific focus on cybersecurity governance, internet governance, surveillance, and big data. And to his left is Paul Vixie, an American computer scientist who created the first DNS infrastructure company in the world and is the author of a dozen or so internet standards documents. He is also the founder of the first US-based commercial internet exchange and the first anti-spam company. And he's the CEO of Farsight Security. So in lieu of opening statements, I'm going to ask a question to launch our discussion. Midway through, I'll open up to some questions from the audience, then we'll pick up the discussion again and finish with more Q&A. So let's start with you, Paul. Just what do we mean by the core internet? What are the critical elements, and just how much of a threat to critical internet infrastructure does an IoT attack pose?
Thank you, Ellen. The core of the internet is not a place any more than any other part of cyberspace would be a place. You can't go there and put a fence around it or armed guards or whatever. It's also not a place on the topology. It used to be thought that the internet service providers who route most of the traffic for the rest of us was the core, but at this point you can't think about it that way because there's so many things on the internet that everybody needs to be able to reach. And so to me there's an 80-20 rule in place. About 20% of that which is connected to the internet or is carrying internet traffic is utterly depended upon by the other 80%. And defending something that amorphous is hard. You can't necessarily define your risk profile, define which attackers for what motives might come after you in which ways. But it certainly includes the core routers belonging to the biggest ISPs. It would include a lot of the DNS infrastructure. But it's arguable that the economy of the world would slow down a lot if there were a large successful attack against Facebook or Google or Amazon as well. So you might have to include those as things that need protection because otherwise everybody hurts when they're attacked. The character of botnet is interesting. I don't think we would have the crime situation we have today on the internet if so many devices were not under the control of people who don't own them, didn't pay for them, don't operate them, etc. But we have now tens of millions, hundreds of millions of devices that are running other people's software and are behaving maliciously in a way that their actual owners would never permit if they knew about it. That is what enables all of the attacks that we currently care about. In other words, if a criminal had to buy connectivity in their own name and use their own connectivity in order to progress their attacks, there would be very little crime. And in that sense, your characterization of these IoT devices as either low cost or high value is a good one because those low cost devices don't get very much QA. They're out in the field in very short market windows with very slim margins.
QA being quality assurance?
Quality assurance, thank you. And they are not themselves the targets of attacks because they're low cost, they're low value. If you attack them, nobody's going to pay a ransom to get it back, etc. But they are absolutely the necessary gateway to attacking the high value targets because criminals can't do that from their own infrastructure. And so the high value targets are the ultimate target. That's what criminals are in business to get a hold of, is your laptop, your contact list, that kind of thing. So we have to secure both. One is harder than the other for economic reasons, but really I'm bridging too many concepts here. The core is not made up of either.
Sandro, what do you think? Is a low-value device-created botnet more of the threat here, the concern, or targeted attacks on the high-value targets?
Well, frankly, I don't think that the low-cost IoT device really pose such a big threat, nor botnets at large. So, I mean, we tend to talk about them a lot because they're highly visible, but really, I mean, of all the things I know from auditing and from high-value IoT, I mean, you just said low-value IoT has no QA. High-value IoT doesn't have any bigger, better QA either, at least everything I know. Be it in automotive, in defense electronics, in critical infrastructures. It's all basically coming from small suppliers, small, medium enterprises with no idea how to properly do quality assurance in code, let alone security quality assurance, which is different from functional quality assurance and stuff like that. So all that we see in this whole Internet of Things, the larger picture of Internet of Things, including cars, airplanes, air traffic ground controls, critical infrastructures, nuclear power plants, every little computer that's not sitting on a desktop, but somewhere in the machinery, and somehow is connected to the internet through a bunch of intermediaries, proxies nobody had ever thought about. All of this is just as vulnerable. And then what we're worried about, at least in Germany, in the large enterprise segment and the technology companies, is targeted attacks on these things. Because we've seen in tests and audits, we've seen a lot of possibilities to attack whole technology planes in targeted attacks on these devices. You can get into one of these devices fairly easily, and then you can use that to target the technology backbone of all similar devices, send out an attack to all other devices, and then like a few thousand cars don't work anymore, or a few thousand air traffic ground control systems don't work anymore, the production sites don't work anymore. So this whole problem of defining the technology plane from IoT devices is very uncertain. And especially if you have high value, or let's put it, sophisticated targeted attacks on them, right now they're pretty defenseless, unfortunately. But, yeah.
How catastrophic really are we talking here? How much should we be worried? Is this really feasible?
Super catastrophic. I mean, in comparison to that's the one thing that always gets me excited when I hear about like the Mirai botnet taking out Twitter or Facebook for a while. So what the fuck, you know? So what? I mean, I have attacks. I know attacks in labs which actually exist, which can take down a fair share of the Fortune 500 companies overnight and for good, permanently. And it can take down whole fleets of cars, whole fleets.
That could take down a fair share of the Fortune 500 companies?
Fairly certain, yeah.
Okay. But not using the Mirai bot type botnet.
No, botnets. You don't need botnets for that. That's targeted stuff on sort of backbone things inside the economies, which people don't really know about, don't really care about, which they're starting to think about now because they realize that there's a big fat problem sitting right underneath them. But there's so much more interesting things you can do. You can bring down whole economies. You can bring down the world economy. You can kill hundreds and thousands of people. I know attacks like that as well. They exist in labs. Some of them have been tested under real-world conditions. That's the stuff we should be worrying about. Unfortunately, that's not the stuff that hits the news. Just an interesting thing, though, is that just the last 2 days, there have been ICS advisories on WannaCry from medical IT providers. So Siemens Medical and Toshiba Medical have been issuing ICS as advisories, if you want to look into it, over the last 2 days, saying, sorry, there might be a little problem with the WannaCry thing in our medical IT, maybe even going to intensive care, and you may want to unplug those from the internet for a while. So that's an indicator of things that can happen.
Dennis, what's your take on this? Are these sorts of attacks actually feasible, do you think?
Well, technically, I'll leave that to my other panelists.
Okay.
I want to come back first to the point of the critical internet infrastructure. A report we did at my organization, the Council, we talked about the public core of the internet. And sort of resonating with what Paul said, we said, okay, there is a public core of the internet that is sort of consisting of the integrity and the availability of the core forwarding and naming functions. That's sort of a formulation that has obviously a lot in back of it, but that is something that I think we do need to worry about. Because one thing, as everybody knows, one thing about the Mirai botnet was what it did, what it attacked, and that was the DNS. And that was actually one of the first times that was targeted, and I'm not absolutely sure that that will be the last time, even though it's not that easy to take these things down, but it is something that we all depend upon. The other thing is, if you talk about attacks, you talk about a target, you talk about a method, and you talk about an actor. And this is sort of the discussion that's going here, because if you look at Mirai botnet, that was probably not a state actor. It wasn't. Although I'm not sure that state actors were not taking notes, thinking, okay, this could be interesting.
Right.
But the target is the DNS infrastructure. That makes it interesting and makes it also a different level kind of attack that has happened, different from what has happened before. The method, I think, if you look at what happened, I mean, it was a big inconvenience and a lot of things happened, but nobody died, nothing happened. All the Fortune 500 companies were fine. I mean, this is a very different area. And it also matters who is the actor behind it, because if this was a script kiddie or whatever it was not a state. Whereas we've seen with the Sony hack, if you look there at the target and you look at the method, that would not necessarily mean it's a national security issue, but because there was North Korea involved, then it becomes a different thing. So if you have these three, you sort of need to figure out where you are on that scale, and then I can imagine that there is much more devastating attacks possible. Apparently Sandro has them brewing in his laboratory, but you also have to ask, who's going to do that?
Exactly.
And for what reason, and how does that work? Who will do that?
Yeah, in fact, to any of you, how does the calculus change if, for instance, it's a nation state or a terrorist group that's behind the attack? That was behind, let's say, Mirai, for instance, the Dyn attack, which didn't kill anybody. And how would that change our perception of the threat and our responses? Anyone want to take that on?
Well, I think it's fairly difficult to distinguish between the two actors right now. I mean, there's a lot of hype with the threat intelligence community and the big data and AI whizzes that they pretend to be able to identify attackers and to identify types of attackers, but I'm fairly certain that's not possible, because from what we know from offense teams is that they have a fair share of effort into creating pseudonymity, into creating false traces, into testing this against AI mechanisms. And to be honest, AI is still statistics. So if I know the traces I leave and I know how to control them, a friend of mine has built a mechanism, an automated sort of spoofing obfuscation machine that can create an attack or refurbish an attack in a way that 98% of all digital traces point to someone else. So how are you going to distinguish who's behind that? So the whole attribution story, I think, feeds in there very, very heavily. Plus, we see a strong interest from criminals to look like nation states,
right,
and a strong interest from nation states to look like criminals.
Yeah.
So if you have, because that's an obvious tactic. So nation states are interested in not being that responsible. If you don't want to be responsible, unless of course you want everybody to know that it has been you. And criminals find that very convenient as well, unless it's a stupid state that's getting angry with you, like Russia. So you don't want to look like Russia, but if you make it look like it's an attack from North Korea, the North Koreans are not getting after you, and everybody will be happy to have an attack from North Korea, because that's something everybody expects and everybody loves to talk about. So I think it's fairly difficult to distinguish that.
Though I hear from U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies that we're getting much better at attribution, and the United States had high confidence in their attribution of the Sony attack to North Korea and recent Russian the hacks of the DNC to Russia. So
but only if you have human intelligence. That's the difference. So the CIA may have information from other sources. If you have human intelligence that actually matches the signals intelligence you're having or the forensics you're having, then you have proof. If it's only digital traces, you have nothing.
Paul, what's your sense of this? How does the calculus change if we're talking now about a nation state or a terrorist group behind an attack that was otherwise, attributed to, say, script kiddies or criminals?
I think it's true that it won't matter in the end, because the way you defend yourself and the future attacks that are indicated by this are the same no matter how the attribution comes out. So I think we focus a little bit too much sometimes on attribution. There's an aphorism that runs around in the DevOps community, which is what currently rules the world in cyberspace, which is that I don't always test my code, but when I do, it's in production. Now, that's supposed to be a joke, and it's unfortunately not a joke, but when you look at these attacks, sometimes they're for what's called lulz. In other words, I did it because it was funny. Other times, it is somebody trying, basically it's a job interview. They're saying, I want to sell capabilities of this kind, and so I have to demonstrate them first and claim credit for them in order that people will then pay me to do this same type of attack for commercial motives. They also have to test their attack methods, and you can't build a test lab that allows you to prove to a potential client, or even prove to yourself for the purpose of planning a larger attack, that your method is going to work. You actually have to go take something out and find out what the defenders do and find out whether you can cope with whatever they do long enough to make the attack meaningful and make it a good stepping stone toward what you want to do next. And unfortunately, a lot of this is just that. And so as to who is doing it for that reason, it won't matter. You still have to worry about all of the things that will lead to. And of course, the attacker will not be the only ones observing what worked and what didn't. An attack against anybody is education for everybody.
Dennis?
No, I especially agree with that last point. That's very true. But it also matters, because you're right. I mean, it doesn't matter where it comes from. In the first instance, the reaction you have to do is the reaction you have to do. But if you go further down the line, it does matter. It matters in terms of what the intensity of a kind of attack was, how heavy was it. And if it points to a state actor, that opens up a totally different toolbox than if it was a criminal actor. So there is reason why we try to think about attribution and try to think about how that works. And then, like you say, I mean, often you need human intelligence, and then you get the problem. Okay, human intelligence usually doesn't really get out in the open. So you get people proving things by saying, well, it's really proven, but we can't really tell you how we proved it, but it's really proven. So that makes it, that's another layer, sort of, the humans will help you to point in the right direction, but it will not help you sort of in terms of international legitimacy if you want to act on it, or it will help you only in a limited sense. So I think it really matters. It does matter.
It does.
Intensity and whether you can prove it's.
Talk a little bit about the toolbox this opens up then, once we've attributed to, say, a state actor.
Well,
And in terms of deterrence as well, right?
Well, again, it depends, I think, in terms of what kind of level we're talking about. I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, but there's threshold values for attacks and what constitutes an attack, and that basically opens up the toolbox.
I mean, with something like the Dyn attack, which inconvenienced people for a few hours, but didn't kill anyone, it didn't take out any Fortune 500 companies. Is that something that we would even want to respond to as a nation, as a government? Or, would you wait to see more severe impacts, either physical effects, or as in the case of Sony in North Korea, there was an assault on a core principle of American democracy, which is freedom of speech, which in the end also moved the U.S. to act. Paul?
So the Sony attack opened up the toolbox of state action against North Korea. There were new sanctions. So Sony, in that sense, had help from the U.S. government in trying to deter future attacks of this kind. In other words, if you do something like this to somebody like us, something like that might happen to you. Whereas the Mirai attack did not open that toolbox. There was nobody from the FBI, I assume, sitting at the table saying, yeah, this looks like a threat to the U.S. economy. I better take this to my bosses, and we're going to figure out how to run it upstairs. And so I do see that certainly that will make a difference. And so you're right. Down the line, after the initial defense is over and the initial sort of retrenchment is over, it matters who attacked you. But I'd say what makes a bigger difference is not whether it was state action or criminal action, but whether it was targeted. Because if it's random drive-by from some botnet that's just scanning, looking for victims and so forth, it doesn't matter who owns that botnet, you're going to defend against it in one way. But if it's somebody who's got you in their sights and they're going after you and they're mapping your infrastructure and your vulnerabilities, you should expect that that's going to continue. And again, it won't matter. It'll matter in terms of whether you get state help or not for repelling state attacks, but what you actually have to do in terms of defending against a targeted attack, again, won't depend very much on who launched it.
Mm-hmm. Sandro, you wanted to?
Yeah, just I think it will be, and it maybe should be, a case-to-case decision on a political level. It will be a political decision anyway. So in the end of the day, if it's international and states are concerned, then you have to have a political decision maker saying, okay, I want to pursue this or I don't want to pursue this, because it automatically will be part of the big picture. And you may not want to have strong principles on that you have to say, okay, this is the threshold, and from this threshold onwards, I have to react more strongly, as it was suggested in the Tallinn manual, for instance. Because in that case, you're sort of tied to principles, political principles, which you have to comply to remain credible, but then you also fall victim to sort of the counter toolbox of attackers. When they look at stances like this, then they can easily craft false flag operations, cause escalations among different parties, and that's also always an option. So that's sort of the part and parcel of the pseudonymity problem in attribution, is that you can always excite different parties to a level that they escalate tensions, and then you can use that, especially if you know that they have a certain toolbox that starts at the threshold here, and then they're going to do this and that, then it's fairly easy to calculate the tactics to create an escalation.
I just, in terms of scoping the threat, Sandro, could I ask you to tell us, you said you don't think that the low-value botnets are really the issue, but in terms of defending the core internet, can you think of a scenario in which you see a targeted attack, let's say, on the core internet that rises to, say, a national security threat level?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you take down a German DAX company, that would be something that's a national security problem for Germany. Anything that's a problem for our national economy, it would automatically be on the political level that forces the government to react strongly. One way or another, and the same applies if people die. So if I manage to get crash planes, for instance, by attacking air traffic ground control systems, which is fairly easy, then also I have to react to that. It could be an act of terrorism, could be an act of organized crime, but at any rate, that would be something that would, where the higher state level would have to make political decisions.
And Dennis? How?
Yeah, it also matters what you do with it. I mean, if you use a botnet to have basically an availability attack, you crowd it and people can't reach the system, so people can't reach the internet. However, we talked about WannaCry before, and that is a different kind of injection you put into the system. If you lock it down, or if you, even worse, start sending something in that actually destroys files or something like that, you get a different kind, or start messing with files that sort of creates uncertainty about whether the system still works as it's supposed to do. So your integrity of the system gets more complicated. These kind of things would take it quite a notch up from what we've seen with the Mirai botnet and the attack on DIN, because it would just wreak more havoc. It would take more time to respond to it. There is redundancy in the system, and that will take up, obviously, part of the problem. But if you target this well, there is ample opportunity to make a lot bigger mess than the Mirai botnet has with the DIN attack.
Paul?
So I'm sorry if I gave the implication earlier that the high-value targets are harder targets, or get more QA. Right now they don't, it's all junk. But there are fewer of them. It's harder to get a copy to study it. And there is at least hope in the case of industrial control or automotive self-driving cars, that kind of thing, that there will be some kind of regulation, minimum standards of testing and so forth for the high-value devices, because, among other things, they are responsible for human life and safety. There is no hope that that's going to happen for baby monitors. So the small market window and the small margin of the low-cost devices really does drive a difference in character. But I want to emphasize, they are not attacked for their own assets. You very rarely attack a baby monitor so that you can watch the baby sleeping. You're attacking a baby monitor so that you can use it to do something else. Whereas if you're attacking a car, it may be because you want to put that driver in a ransom situation or kill them to steer into a post or something like that. So the reasons for attacking change because of the economics of the two classes of devices. Now, we've certainly seen in some high-profile attacks that the point-of-sale system can be attacked through the air conditioning system, and that didn't happen because somebody deliberately designed that vulnerability in. It happened incrementally. One person added one network, another person later added another network, and the only person who actually put it all together and figured out what was possible was the bad guy. And so at the moment, the bad guys know more about how our technology works than the good guys, and they know more about how we're using it than we do. And that is what I think puts the core at risk. You can't attack the core using an internet connection that you paid for in your own name. You have to have these intermediaries. Now, whether you use them for DDoS or just as jumping off points or clouds to operate from within, that doesn't matter. The fact that these low-cost devices are formed into these botnets is creating a very different threat environment than we would have without that.
So what does that suggest about a potential for solution? You mentioned some form of regulation. Is there any, do you think there is a role to play here for regulation? Is that the only way? Can voluntary norms or best practices be counted on?
Well, in my country at this time, regulation is out of favor, but I think it could be done. It has been done. We've created a better life safety standard for a lot of kinetic devices. It's generally not possible to buy a home appliance that is likely to burn your house down while you're sleeping. And so something like that could certainly be done. It just can't be done at the low end because there's too many companies competing against too many other companies, and they're all in the same market window. They all have the same suppliers, and it's time to market that matters.
So,
Dennis?
just a follow-up question on that. If not there, what is the level? Suppose the United States will regulate again someday in the future. So what would be a level where you could actually make a difference? Because it will only be making a difference. You can't solve it, I think.
I actually spoke to somebody who works in the automotive control systems environment recently, and he said there is a lot of pressure on, not regulatory pressure, but from the industry pressure to meet some minimum standards so that we don't send something out there with some buffer overflow vulnerability that causes anybody who connects to the Bluetooth in the car to be able to affect the brake controller or whatever. So I think that liability is starting to rear its head, and people are starting to change the way they make their investments because they don't want to get sued for, negligent homicide or whatever that would then be called. So there's some hope there, but the only times that's going to work is when it will be loss of life. When it's loss of property, you're not going to see people moving differently.
Yeah, because I would say liability and reputation are sort of the two mechanisms you have, but that only applies to certain companies. Not all companies are vulnerable to that or care about that. And especially at the low end, I would say that's probably very difficult.
I think there's a lot of transactions before a device reaches the consumer, and you don't know who's in the supply chain, and so their reputation will never control your buying decisions. But I certainly want to note that Volkswagen was caught recently doing some bad things with computers and hasn't hurt their sales at all. So I think that we are...
Made a dent in their profits, though.
Yeah, I made a dent in their profits, but they did not lose consumer confidence. No. And I think that that's the pattern we're going to see.
Okay. Sandro?
Yeah, Germans love regulation. Any kind of regulation, and so we're very keen right now on regulating exactly those high-value safety-critical devices. So this is something that has come up on multiple things we had with the Bundestag and other ministries, and actually right now there's a strong alliance among the leading parties in Germany after the election to push software liability into law. And we're fairly certain that that will happen. Of course, we're receiving a lot of opposition from the IT industry because they don't want any kind of liability for anything, just as they had over the past decades. But it's fairly clear for all the policymakers that this can't continue the way it does. And it's also, they're getting also the request from the German technology companies who have to buy and integrate this IT, that they want better liability standards. Because right now, when you're a German tech company and you buy SAP, for instance, you integrate that into your product, then you are liable for your product, but SAP is not liable for its product when you have a conglomerate. So when your product is being attacked through SAP, you have to pay all the money, and SAP just gets out free. So this is something they don't tolerate anymore, so there's a strong opposition to the lack of software liability, and we're going to define standards of software liability very soon, which start exactly with buffer overflow, because that's completely unnecessary to have buffer overflows in your code. But that problem was solved theoretically, I think, 1975 or something. The same with injection, and a bunch of vulnerabilities which are just don't have to be there, and which are low-hanging fruits.
That's interesting.
So that's something that's...
Well, is that mainly because the manufacturers have decided it's in their best market interest to do the right thing, or are consumers demanding this? Why aren't the companies saying, oh no, regulation is going to hurt innovation, as we hear so often in the US?
Well, it's basically the integrators of IT are sick and tired of the lousy products that are being delivered from the IT industry, and they want better standards. They want higher standards. They do have a problem to some extent with their own supply chain, because their own IT supply chain is many small and medium enterprises coding small bits and pieces into their products, and they know that they will have a hard time with security quality assurance. But at least they want the big backbone products to have a minimum standard of quality assurance, at least when it comes to safety. And we're fairly certain that when it comes to safety-critical products, that this regulation will be a first step, and that this will accelerate very quickly. So 2 principles we proposed for the German government to apply in safety-critical devices is, first of all, the safety-first principle. So whenever IT is connected to something that's safety-critical, you have to assume the highest risk category and apply all the best practices, best methods you could possibly think of. And the second, and the more funny principle, and we're curious if they will swallow it, because that would have very far-reaching implications, is the principle of the consistency of safety and security assumptions. So it's actually, I think it's a no-brainer, sort of a no-brainer. So if you say that a safety-critical device can only crash in terms of safety 1 in a million cases, like a brake of a car can only fail in 1 in a million cases, then probably I should define the same standard for attacks. So if it should only be attackable for 1 in a million cases. But here, if you know security, you know that security is so very bad that this is still like 15 years from now. So if that consistency principle, which I think sounds fairly reasonable, gets through, then we'll have a huge setback in all the IT and safety critical devices, and everything will have to be remodeled and get new architectures, which I think would be a very responsible move.
Okay. So I'd like to open it up to the audience now for just a couple of questions. If you'll raise your hand and wait for the mic, then identify yourself and your affiliation. Someone in the middle there of the room.
Thank you. My name is Marilia Maciel and I work for Diplo Foundation in Geneva. My question is to Professor Dennis. I pretty much agree with you that there is a core infrastructure that it's different. You can cause economic damages if you attack Facebook or Amazon or whatever, but there is a core infrastructure that will bring damage not only to a particular country, but to us all, because we are all connected and dependent on it, and you gave the example of the DNS. But my question relates to the panel just before. Professor Smith said that sovereignty applies to everything that is located in the territory of a given country. And we have these critical infrastructures, such as the DNS and Internet exchange points, located in the territory. Does it mean that the country itself would be able to dismantle or to somehow attack this infrastructure to cause damage beyond its borders, let's say, if this country is in a conflict with another country? So what is the responsibility that these countries that host critical infrastructure have to protect it and not to use its sovereignty rights to damage it?
Yeah, that's also a relation. You can try to regulate it down, but also when it comes to this core infrastructure, you can't really do anything when it comes to criminal attacks. That will be difficult, but you can sort of try to regulate state behavior, and that is sort of what we're referring to. And yes, sovereignty is a massive issue, because To some extent, we have some core protocols and the way they work. You can't really say those are national. I mean, protocol is per definition not national, I think. However, it hits the ground at some point. So, for example, internet exchanges, for example, routers, DNS servers, and then it does become a question. And I'm not a legal expert, but we have other examples where we think about these things. If we think about the common, the way we treat the River Rhine, for example, the fact that part of the Rhine is actually in Germany or in the Netherlands, does not necessarily mean you can chuck everything in it that you want to, because there's a repercussion that flows downstream. And I think you have a similar issue here. I mean, if a undersea cable comes and lands in the Netherlands, then technically, yes, it's within the Dutch territory. It's within there's still ownership questions, of course, but cutting that cable just because you can, not that that would happen, but cutting the cable because it's within your sovereignty will have massive repercussions over the borders. So that is something where we have to think about is how this system works, how this distributed system works, what it does for all of us, because we have all built everything we have in terms of our digital economies, digital societies on top of the functioning of this thing. And what does that mean in terms of what states can and cannot allow themselves to do with this core infrastructure?
Mm-hmm. That's really good.
So I'd like to follow up. I operated an internet exchange in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I am a little bit surprised that this has not been, that the internet exchanges, as a specific example, haven't been used in state action so far. Yeah. So for example, after the DNC hack was attributed to Russia, there were some new sanctions put on various Russian people, but there was no effort by the US to attempt to get various Russian internet companies disconnected from US internet exchanges. And so while it is certainly on US territory and there's probably some executive order path that could be used for that, no one even thinks about it, because I think it's because the ability to communicate with the adversarial economy and the adversarial government in this way is valuable, whether it's for intelligence gathering or whatever else it is. But I think if we start to see more global conflicts, then we're going to see that tool used. They won't cut the cable, but they will certainly find the assets belonging to companies that are in the country that you're having trouble with, and you'll just say that our sanctions include the inability of those companies to do business in our country, and so they will run and cut specific cables, not the whole big fat one that's got everything, but specific cables. I think that's inevitable.
But that would be interesting in a not so nice way to see where that goes, because that would probably incite sort of a race to the bottom, because once that cat is out of the door, more people are going to use it. And then we get sort of in a game of disconnecting, which is going to be hurtful for the economy, I would say.
I agree.
So an interesting use case was several years ago, maybe 2011, 2012, when Iran was doing DDoS attacks against US banks, financial systems, and the banks were they were divided. Some of them wanted the U.S. to take some action to counter or stop or just stop the pain against the banks. Some of the banks felt like no, we didn't want the U.S. to take any action because then it might just provoke a stronger response from Iran, retaliatory response. In the end, the U.S. did go to using diplomatic channels a number of countries in Europe and around the world to ask them to please cooperate through their certs to help to disrupt the botnets that were sending all the traffic, DDoSing the banks. They did try that. It had some effect, mitigating effect. In the end, Iran, I think, stopped mainly because it wanted to not to undermine the nuclear talks going on. But I think that was one example of how states might join together in sort of a cooperative effort to address a threat to a particular sector. There was also some debate about whether the level of the attack was after all, it was a DDoS. It wasn't a destructive attack. So, you know, how much of a response can you take?
But this sort of taps into the idea of the toolbox. I mean, sort of the banks are basically clamoring, so okay, we need to escalate.
Some
So
were
basically
saying
something has to
yep.
be done, and apparently the government chose to de-escalate, sort of source it out more to the technical community to see what they can do, use diplomatic channels. So there is a bandwidth in what you can and cannot do with these things.
Yeah, I think the U.S. government came to, you know, for better or for worse, a decision then that the level of the effect, the impact, had not crossed a threshold that required, say, a public calling out or imposition of sanctions. Some might disagree with that, but that was their conclusion. But yet, it was disruptive enough that they felt they needed to do something. Anyway, do we have another question before we move on? Here?
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to play musical microphone here. I'm Liisa Past, and I'm with the Estonian Information System Authority, and my question follows on from this discussion in terms of cross-border dependencies of these critical internet infrastructures, because these dependencies are often one-way. A DNS server has a number of other services reliant on it, but doesn't rely on those services, and often also the market forces are consolidating in one way. And secondly, national legislation is incredibly varied. A critical service or, you know, an essential service or critical infrastructure in one nation might not be defined as such in other. What would your recommendations be? And would they be to these corporations that are running these incredibly consolidated international business processes, or would they be to governments? You know, where do we start? Because right now it's an empty drawing board.
Mm-hmm. Sandro?
Yeah, I think a lot of that, a lot of structures are actually in place. I mean, at least in the German industry community and in the telcos, we know that they entertain relations to all, on the CISO level, to all the CISOs within their industry. The banking sector has standing relations to all the CISOs in Europe, to the banks. The telcos have the same. And then in Germany, we also have a group that's just called CSSA. It's interesting. You could look into that. That's like all the big German companies, the top 30 companies, having the CIOs and CISOs sit together every 1 or 2 months and exchange information. So there's a lot of these informal networks, and whenever anything serious happens, it mostly happens in the private sector, then you automatically have all these informal networks, you have all these connections, you start cooperating with each other very quickly. So I think to strengthen these informal structures, informal talks on the industry-to-industry level is very highly important, especially on the telco level, because that's sort of the backbone. They understand the system in the best way possible, and they can act more quickly and more agile in absence of strong rules and strong regulation, because then you have to go through all the institutions. And sometimes if they have to be swift and quick, it's better to have the industry-to-industry contract and simply solve the problem without having to consult ministries and state institutions before that. Apart from that, of course, we have the whole national cert level institutions cooperating with each other, and there's a lot of informal contacts there as well. But I think the main thing you should do is to strengthen these informal networks, to keep them up and running, to have sort of regular meetings of the CISOs so they know each other, so they know how to contact each other on issues, how to recognize issues which may be cross-border, and that's the best way right now to solve these problems.
Dennis?
I totally agree with that, but there's another level that is above that. If you talk about critical infrastructure, like you said, it means something different in various countries, and yet it took sort of states trying to figure out the rules of the road for how they act on the internet vis-a-vis each other. It took until the 2015 UNGGE to have an article in there that says, okay, we should not attack in peacetime critical infrastructures. And they use the term critical infrastructures even though they all well know that there is a myriad of differences behind that, but it's still something that is worthwhile. It's still something to put it out there. The same version of the UNGGE had something which seems, in light of also what Sandro said, as commonsensical as could be, saying, okay, thou shalt not use a cert to attack another country, nor shall you attack the cert of another country. So basically separating out, okay, there is a bunch of organizations within each country that are responsible for making sure that the network functions, and we should leave those out of the layers that have to do with national security. So a number of the things that go on in the international norms formulation are still fairly commonsensical. But one of the interesting things, I think, is that as far as I can see, the critical internet infrastructure, sort of the core internet infrastructure that is global, does not fall under the idea of a critical infrastructure. And I think that is one of the next steps we can take to sort of see if we can get, at the level of states, some sort of agreement about where, also tapping into the point about sovereignty, so where does sovereignty end? What kind of things should we sort of leave be and should not be on the board when we escalate into higher levels of conflict?
It does in Germany, though. It's a critical
And in the US.
infrastructure.
It happens on
Telcos.
national level, yeah. But not on the international level. So that's different. I mean, if Germany has it, that's fine, but other countries do not have it, and there's no common understanding of what sort of the component parts are of what you could call global critical infrastructure and how we should deal with that or not deal with it.
So that's another area where we need an internationally agreed upon norm.
Yeah, and that's going to be a long, tiresome process. But yeah, I think that is.
Mike Schmidt was saying, yes. Yeah. Paul, did you want to weigh in?
I do. So the asymmetry, where a DNS server, for example, is depended upon but does not have very many dependencies of its own, is true at the national economy level also. Any given country is known to have some preferred exports and some preferred imports. They're obviously going to be different things. Now, I want to agree that the kind of informal cooperation that we get at the commercial level is extremely valuable and would be hard to replicate in government because it's targeted, it's focused, it's motivated, the alignment of interests is quickly discovered. But these commercial actors are under some constraints that a national government response might not be. In other words, we try to limit our own liability in how we reply. We don't break the law. We don't have the freedom to set aside certain laws when we're defending or perhaps counterattacking. The counterattack is not one of our options. And we also use the absolute bare minimum of both time and force. So I'm not sure how long it will take, but after one of the attacks that was attributed to North Korea, they were disconnected from the SWIFT network. Their banks were no longer able to participate in the global economy. That's not going to last forever. That is, if you wanted a sanction like that to last a long time, it would have to happen at the government level. Because what the commercial level is going to do is try to get through today, try to get through the current quarter, trying to get through the current earnings season. And they don't want controversy, and they don't want to be global enforcers of the right and the wrong. That is something appropriately left to sovereigns. So I think that even though there are some things that the sovereigns can't do that the commercial sector is doing very well today, the reverse is also true.
And the question of sovereignty and something globalish, SWIFT, sort of runs into the same problem. So who gets to exert sovereignty over SWIFT? Which is not a given, even though it's actually located somewhere. But it's such a global mechanism that, okay, is it okay for one state to say, okay, I'll take this out? I mean, it's an open question. I don't know anything about SWIFT. So
are there certain actions or roles that are most appropriate for the government to take on, to play in terms of protecting the core, and others that are, as you mentioned, best left to the companies? And what would those be that the state should be reserved to the state and that states should think about acting on? Do you have any prescriptions, any policy suggestions, guidelines?
Well, I mean, anything that has to do with, like Paul said, law enforcement or deterrence. Hackback, for instance, is a popular thing. Hackback is a popular thing right now, which is being discussed in Germany as well. If you have to switch off an attack by hacking into a command and control server that's situated somewhere in Russia or in Asia, That's something a company can't do and the private sector shouldn't be doing, or maybe doesn't want to be do because they would be attacking a big customer like the Chinese government, and they don't want the Chinese government to be angry with this company. So
You mean
they're
in the
kicking it out
midst
of
of
the
an
country.
ongoing attack?
Yeah, so that would have to be something that a state has to do, and that a state has to be capable to do.
That is quite controversial in the U.S. How do you view that, Dennis, the hackback?
Well,
option?
it is massively controversial because, well, the sovereignty issues again, and sort of. But on the other hand, it's also sort of a waiting game. I mean, these companies are waiting for someone to actually act on these things. Governments have the authority to do it under certain circumstances, and then we come again to problems like attribution, knowing exactly where it is and what you're doing. So you're sort of between a rock and a hard place between these things, because the companies are bearing the brunt of what's going on. All they have is defense, and if you shift it, and they can't do it for legal reasons, because there's very good reasons not to do that.
Right.
Both commercial and international legal, but then you shift it towards the government, which is also not often able to act, because it needs to fulfill a different list of requirements to actually be able to act. So this is a bit of a conundrum.
So hackback is controversial, and appropriately so.
Yeah.
And it's not just a matter that should be left to sovereigns, but it is also something that you can't do reliably enough. In spite of the fact that 80% of the internet depends on the other 20%, more or less, you don't necessarily know which part of that 20% is nearby the thing that you would like to hack back. So on the internet, it is fairly easy to saw off the tree branch that you are hanging from and end up hurting yourself, even though you were...
Or others, yeah.
or hurting friends. The collateral damage that you can do with hackback is huge. And there's also often a very interesting problem with cleanup efforts. So, you know, if you learn the encryption key that's used for some botnet command and control somewhere, you might decide, gee, I think since I can now control all these machines, I'm going to patch them. But during the Conficker episode in 2009, we made a few sporadic phone calls to try and get some particularly egregious Conficker bot populations cleaned up. One was to a hospital in the greater Atlanta, Georgia metro. And after we got shunted through the various phone tree to the guy who actually understood what Conficker was, he said, oh yeah, I recognize that IP address. That is an embedded Windows XP system inside of a portable X-ray machine that has been certified by the FDA. I can't patch that. And I certainly would not want to be the guy whose fingers were on the keyboard when it got patched because somebody outside knew the right password to do the patch, because that could be a life safety issue. You don't know if that machine is doing something important at the moment that you need it to reboot to update your code. So all of this depends on the unreal sort of television fiction that it's possible to have complete knowledge, and it's just not. So
I think you can solve a part of that problem if you design the tactics properly. So one thing you can certainly take down fairly easy is shared CNC boxes, which are used by the crime community, the black market community. You more or less know where they are, and a lot of intelligence services are using them as well. Those are fixed servers, fixed boxes somewhere. If you take them out surgically, and you have the capability to do that surgically and just take those out, putting in localization conditions, I think you should be fine. In any case, you should have hackbacks do your foreign intelligence guys. You can always say, well, it was me.
Okay, yes, sir.
Okay, my name is Wolfgang Kleinwächter. I'm a professor emeritus from the University of Aarhus. I'm also a member of the new Global Commission, and I was an ICANN board member. Going back to the attribution, I heard in the first part of your discussion a lot of skepticism about attribution. And you did not comment on the new proposal by Microsoft on an attribution organization. My understanding is the proposal aims at a process which is impartial, neutral, keeps the governments in a certain distance, is rooted in the private sector. Could this be a step forward, or would you say this is another illusion?
I think I think it's industry lobbyism bullshit because they don't want to get their gig right. And I mean, Microsoft is still doing one of the best jobs in the IT industry, to be fair. But of course, it would be much more convenient for the IT industry if somebody would solve the attribution or believe that they could solve the attribution problem, because then they wouldn't have to build proper IT. So of course, the IT industry always loves anything that doesn't have to do with them cleaning up their act. But I think it's, from my point of view, really knowing offense teams a lot and knowing how they build their attacks and how they build pseudonymity these days, I think it's highly dangerous to rely on attribution in any sense, because it automatically makes you much more vulnerable than if you don't. So because I can always craft an attack to look like it's your favorite adversary. And it's fun, if you look at the recent threat reports, the intelligence things, they always have, it's industry actors doing these interpretations, mostly like companies like CrowdStrike, Mandiant, putting out these interpretations, attribution on who has this been, and they're doing it with a commercial interest, of course. So they also want to be quick, so they're the first in the media. And then you have the favorite culprit. It's, right now, in the past, it has been China. Right now, it's Russia and North Korea. So it's always Russia and North Korea. And for me, as an attacker, it's fairly easy to spoof my attack in a fashion that it looks Russian enough, so CrowdStrike or Mandiant will be screaming, oh, Russia has been doing this and that. So I think it's highly dangerous to rely on attribution. I wouldn't buy it.
I don't know. Paul?
I think that the Microsoft effort is sort of well-intended but ill-considered. So not just because attribution is so easy to fake, but because attribution doesn't really buy you very much. As I said earlier, you're not going to change how you defend by much, depending on who it turns out you find was responsible for it. Right? We keep using minimalist responses. We clean up the machines we know are infected, and then whatever else they're infected with will get us tomorrow. I'm concerned that we didn't learn the lesson of who is. Right? Internet identifiers like IP address blocks or domain names are supposed to have reliable contact information, and ICANN, which ClanVector was on the board of, has done a lot of work. They've invested a huge number of dollars and hours trying to keep that system useful, and they have failed. It is not possible to attribute anything to what whois tells you. But I would say again that attribution has to have a purpose, and that purpose is very much in question, because you're not going to use recourse. You're not going to find some way to de-incentivize that actor from those actions.
How not?
So,
Well, I mean, why don't you use, you could try law enforcement, or you could try economic sanctions, you could try diplomatic, you could even try military if you want, warranted. But I mean, if you don't try to hold someone accountable, if you don't, then how can you even try to have a deterrent effect against an adversary?
that is the great question that has plagued us for the last 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Since you can't do anything about it other than defend yourself against similar attacks in the future, you know, that's why we're going to continue to have a disproportional share of the cost and the losses fall on the defenders.
Listen, I wanted to ask a question. Recently, the European Union Cyber Agency and a group of tech companies issued a joint statement urging the European Commission to develop mandatory requirements for security and privacy in the Internet of Things. And this ENISA statement focused on authentication as a threshold issue. So, for example, network operators might block bad IoT devices from connecting to networks, but ISPs can authenticate only those IP addresses that they assign. So how would network operators be able to tell which connections are IoT devices? And with providers scattered throughout the world under different regulatory schemes, how can this be achieved? Paul?
Well, first let me note that Dr. Stephen Crocker, the chairman of the ICANN board for many years, issued a protocol specification on what he called the evil bit, and simply required that all evil actors mark their traffic as evil so that other people could block it.
And they had it right.
And I think he
noted.
I think he was making a broader point, which is that similar to what I said earlier, bad guys are not going to act in their own name. They're going to hide behind other people's assets. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that you would be able to identify something identify its either who owns it or its intent based on its current or previous actions is a little bit crazy. IP addresses are reusable, so the person you're blocking may have changed their IP address. They may be acting from a different IP address 5 minutes later. And what's worse, somebody who is completely innocent may inherit the old IP address. And so the time window during which you could punish, let's say, or somehow constrain the actions of one of these devices is very short. It's so short that the bad guys can design that cost into their attack and simply know in advance that they're going to pay it. And we're no further forward except that we have more complexity.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, on the topic of attribution, some people have said maybe you should go below attribution as a more practical solution. Say, I think it's called the bad packet norm or something, that you should, instead of trying to figure out, this is only helpful when it's actually happening, but you would just say, okay, there's bad packets coming from your network, and I'm not interested in where they come from or who has done it, but you can stop the traffic. So there is room, I think, in certain cases to sort of do away with the attribution because it's not really the thing that matters most at that moment, and that also gets you away from the pointing finger and saying, okay, we need to go. You can just say, okay, stop this traffic, and that could also be, for some cases, a route that is viable. For the higher end cases, and this is sort of what I understand from the Microsoft proposal, that would be very different because then you would have to talk about a really massive sort of attack. It would be something really different. I don't really know what that would be, but there's obviously room for that. But it's really difficult. There's one sort of system that is similar. We have the nuclear monitoring system, but that is of course built on a massive risk in terms of nuclear, and then there's a massive organization built with lots of staff, lots of funding, to basically monitor the world and probably monitoring some parts of the world, but they know what they're looking for. So it's really, yeah, there is similarities, but there's also dissimilarities, like always, but yeah.
Well, to your question of IoT regulation, I think that we're still in a very, very early stage when it comes to that, because there's a lot of very different regulations from all different sectors feeding into that as well. So most of the sectors like banking, automotive, critical infrastructures have their own sort of regulation which already applies to the Internet of Things in that specific sector. And now they're looking at harmonizing these, if they have to harmonize this, which kinds of standards they're setting up. The new industry standards, 62443 is just coming up, which defines a lot of these IoT standards for the future, but still all of that is still in a very early stage. But yet I think it's not a problem of identifying these in the internet because the regulation will apply to the producers. So the regulation will be pushed down to the producers of IoT devices. It will define standards for security, for privacy, also to the startups and whatever, which will do something with the data. So I think it can be applied if you address the right kind of actor. It will not address the telcos.
Okay.
So I mentioned earlier that one of the enablers of the crime wave that we see on the internet in these decades is being able to act through proxies and not have to purchase infrastructure and use it maliciously in your own name. Another is the ability of these actors to also live a double life as a normal citizen. In other words, if somebody were applying for a job and they were talking about their hobbies, they would not say, and I'm also a DDoS for hire expert, and these are my qualifications, or I am also a spammer, whatever. They rely on the ability to walk among us and to appear to be one of us, and then all of these other activities are kind of in the dark side of their lives. That is inevitable. The internet does not really permit the kind of attribution and recourse that the kinetic world does. You can't prove somebody did something and you can't stop them from doing it again in the way that the military has been pretty good at keeping kinetic attacks off of the soil of various nations. These non-kinetic attacks pass right through. So I mentioned WHOIS as a problem, but it's also a bit of a triumph because the type of controls you would have to have, type of regulations you'd have to have on the internet to permit the level of attribution and recourse that we here might like would inevitably facilitate authoritarianism and would make the internet a very different tool than it is today. But if there is a regulator or a legislature within the sound of my voice, I do have a suggestion, which you asked earlier, and that is change to the liability regime. I don't want to make internet service providers liable for all crimes that they facilitate, because that's really not fair. You don't know what a new customer is going to do.
Right.
And I don't want them to have to police their own content in the sense of preemptive censorship. What I do want is for them to be held liable for any harm to others which occurs after they have been notified that that harm is coming from their network. I would like them to have the sense that I have to take these complaints seriously, or I'm going to be on the hook in dollars. And that plus some insurance reporting so that their liability insurance gets more expensive for everything they do could make a huge difference. Because right now we have ISPs who are facilitating attacks that bear no expense. They have no risk. They have no motivation. Their interests are not aligned with the defense, and we need to align those interests.
Interesting.
I don't entirely agree with that, by the way, because I know a big German telco, and there's only one, so you can reckon who it is, who knows exactly that most of the routers they're buying and employing in the field are full of bugs, because it's the cheapest Chinese product you could possibly use, but it's commercially feasible to do that, but they're still using these things despite the fact that they know that they're very vulnerable and that attacks on these routers are very, very much a possibility. And I know that they had meetings where they getting the CEO out of the room before they were starting about the bugginess of the products they were buying, so he wasn't compliant. So they had solved compliance issues. So I want them to be liable in terms of buying proper IT and looking at security quality assurance in the baseline products you're buying. That's something they're negligent to right now, and they don't like it because the product with the better security quality assurance is more expensive. But that should be something that they should bear in mind.
That might be an area for regulation, right? For government regulation on companies.
But some of this can also be done through reputation mechanisms. It may only work in sort of small markets. For example, in the Netherlands, Michel van Eeten of TU Delft has done good work with his team in sort of monitoring how botnets develop, so how they in the ISPs in the Netherlands. He was smart enough to first go to all of the ISPs and say, this is the methodology that we're going to use. Is this a good methodology? And everyone said, yes, it's a good methodology. And then he came back with the results later. And he got them basically all in a room. And he was surprised by the fact that many of the CTOs, many of the people responsible for this, did not actually imagine that they would be at the place where they would be. And the uptake of what could be done was actually fairly impressive. So the next time they monitored, a number of the really bad apples had really raised their stakes. I mean, it doesn't solve everything, and you need sort of a certain scale for it to work, I think. But that was just mainly through just showing what it is and how you relate to the others, and that actually had quite a decent effect. So liability is one route, but there is also sort of lower hanging fruit than that, I think, because this basically costs next to nothing.
Unfortunately, with IT companies and telco companies in Germany, the thing, if you're trying to be friendly with them and demonstrate to them how bad their product is and how they could improve, the next thing you know is you have 20 lawyers around you who are trying to sue the shit out of you because you're doing bad things to the company. It's not like they want to improve expensive backbone problems. They rather don't want you to talk about it. Unfortunately, that's an attitude that is kind of changing in some areas of the IT industry, to be fair. Unfortunately, not yet in Germany.
Okay, I'd like to open it up again for questions, sir.
Olaf Kollerman, Internet Society. I want to go back to the software liability issue. You have a history in open source software I happen to be aware of, and also open source software that is being used on the core of the internet. Can you give me any comments, and perhaps also from you, Sandra, about about the effect that software liability might have on the viability of open source software, which is, I think, still one of the innovative drivers in the internet.
Well, if you define liability by, for instance, or you could one thing you could do is that you define a certain evaluation assurance level, for instance. So and the open source product you're using satisfies that EAL, then you could use it, and it's sort of liable. But in the end of the day, I think liability could mean that you have to have a company which can sign up for that being liable. So it would kick out, rule out open source software out of many areas where liability has to be enforced.
So, having a background in open source, I would be terrified of saying that a small developer or team would have to worry about liability concerns if there was a bug in their code and they gave it away. Fortunately, that's unlikely to happen. Liability law is mostly anchored in commerce. In other words, you have to actually charge money for something before there is any consideration in the other direction. And so I think that open source is relatively safe, but there are an awful lot of middlemen throughout the supply chain and device producers who import that software without looking at it. And once they sell a device that has that software in it, they should be held liable for harm that is done. Even if it was from code they didn't write, they still made the decision to import it and put it into their product. So I want to create a more robust liability regime, but I feel fairly safe that it's not going to be able to reach back to the open source world in any direct way.
Okay.
That's actually a problem which we discussed in the German Bundestag as well. So we have a lot of machine companies in Germany are using Linux, some sort of Linux distribution inside their products. And they have the problem that they are liable for the machine they build, including all the bugs that could possibly be a problem in there. And so basically including anything that the machine could do terribly to a worker or something. But they don't have a liability chain that reaches back to the software. So if they use Linux and they can't really verify if it's a good Linux version, if it has any kernel bugs, options, anything strange in there, they basically don't know what to do. And I think a lot of them would prefer to buy a commercial product where they have a clear chain of liability, so they can take full liability on the technical product they build, but whenever something is caused by the IT inside the product, which they themselves don't have any control over and which they themselves are not able to understand, they can hand down the liability to the producer of that IT. That would be something they would all prefer to have if liability chains are really defined down to software bugs as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir, second row.
Thorsten Kodalle, Command and Staff College, German Armed Forces. I'm intrigued by this hackback, and in the Cyber Challenge 9/12, the scenario was unfolded around a presidential directive from the US allowing the private sector to do hackbacks. And the banking sector was attacked, they hacked back, and they hit spillover effect the Chinese health sector. And then they had an international conflict. How viable is such a scenario?
Well, to let you in on a little dirty secret, the banking sector is sort of doing grayish operations in hackbacks already for a long time. So, because they want to know what happens to their data, so they have companies they can hire who hack back into these criminal organizations or who do darknet investigations, as they call it, to find data that have been stolen. So,
what do they actually do to do that?
The main reason why they're doing it is that they don't want to. It's illusionary to retrieve the data, because once it's gone, a minute later it's everywhere, or you can't really retrieve it. But they want to understand the risk that this specific leakage caused, or that this specific actor caused. So they want to have a vague idea of who could have been the thief, or where else could this come up, or what else could happen. So that's the main reason why they're doing hackbacks. But from what I heard is that they already move away from that because they don't see any added value from hackbacks. So when they want to shut down denial of service attacks, they have different machines right now to do that and different methods. They don't have to do hackbacks to CNC servers. And knowing where your data went or who stole them is not that profitable or beneficial for your risk assessment as well. So some of the banks who have been doing this in sort of a gray have not really regulated area, have already moved away. And I think it would be interesting for the governments to talk to them, to talk about the experiences they had. But of course, they may be reluctant to talk about the illegal stuff they did to the government.
Paul, briefly.
Yeah.
So from a liability point of view, some hackbacks are pretty safe, even for private industry to undertake, because you're not expecting a criminal complaint from a criminal, because they would have to say, yes, while I was breaking the law, he broke the law. They don't want to do that. But it does, in addition to the diminishing returns problem, where it doesn't help you as much as you'd like it to, that's actually true for the takedown industry in general. Because the more of these machines and domain names and IP address blocks and so forth that we take away from them, the more they will simply find. I never heard a story of a bot master saying, oh, he took my CNC away, I guess I'll give up my life of crime and get a job. So if we can't do something that creates a deterrence, it's almost a waste of time to do anything at all. Other than whatever it takes to live to see tomorrow and keep your network up, keep your company in business. But I want to say hackback creates an additional complication, and that's that it muddies an investigation. It means that if that criminal ever does come to trial, then the hackback is going to be part of the story that the jury has to sort through. And it's better to not do that. It's better to not tamper with the chain and the bucket of evidence and let law enforcement do what little it can do about internet crime.
Okay.
So there's just, it's interesting because for law enforcement, yes, that would definitely be the case. It would muddy the investigation, would temper the evidence, there would be a problem. But what we saw with the Aurora case of Google in China, what they did was something else. They basically did the forensic scouting and they took all the information they had, basically a hackback, legally, and then they took it not to law enforcement, they took it to the state, to the Department of State, who escalated it into an international
Was it
diplomat.
truly a hackback? Wasn't it just a honeypot of some sort that they had?
It was not a hackback in the sense
Yeah.
that they knocked something out, but it was a
Right.
hackback in the sense that Sandro just said, okay, infiltration and getting out information and sort of getting the information on how the attack went, what kind of information, and so in that sense, yes, it was a hackback. It was an operation gaining access to someone else's network. So it depends again, sort of it, because formally the American government would say that's a hackback, you can't do that, but it just got taken up into a diplomatic process, and it was also slightly convenient. So yeah, so it depends where you put it in.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you a question, Dennis, and then we can open it up again to the audience. But in your book, The Public Core of the Internet, you stated the opinion that cyberspace has tilted too far towards offense in the name of national security at the expense of defense and cybersecurity. So do you believe that leaves the core internet vulnerable as a result? And are there areas in which the national security agencies should be restrained, say in the withholding of zero-day vulnerabilities from software makers?
Yeah, well, it's sort of, you see in the last sort of 10 years when you 10 years ago when you would start talking about the internet in government circles, you would be talking with the Ministry of Economic Affairs, you would be talking about telcos, you would talk about e-commerce, all kinds of things, and you see that a lot of the funding and a lot of the investment and a lot of the attention is now going through cybersecurity, sort of increasingly also connected to national security. And someone in the American administration at some point said to me, one of the main fallouts of the Snowden leaks is that other countries say, I want to have this too. So you sort of get a race to all have this. Some are better at it, some are worse at it, some are going to try something, etc. So you also create a sort of an uncertainty. There's a reason we're talking about confidence building measures again, because everybody's looking at each other and thinking, okay, what is going on? What are people doing? What are we doing, and what are the rules of the road? And I think in that, there are risks for what I call the public core of the internet. Some of the things that you can do that are possible could link to that. You can weaken standards, you can tamper with protocols. There's a lot of things in there that are possible, and that is always the problem with talking about cybersecurity. We're always talking about the realm of the possible. Is it conceivable that? Yes, it's conceivable that. We talked about cyber attacks on critical infrastructures for a long time before it actually happened in the context of a conflict, of an open conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And then again, if I talk to people who are responsible for the security of the grid in the Netherlands and parts of Germany, and he said to me, we invest a lot in cybersecurity, it's very important, etc. But if I really wanted to take down the grid, I would take some plastic explosive, it would take two of the big high wire things, I would blow them out, and we're out for a week. And there's only a cow next to it, there's no one there. So it's also a matter of, there's also again the toolbox, it's not just the government toolbox, it's also the toolbox of the offender. I mean, if you want to have a certain effect, cyber could be the answer, but it's not necessarily the most convenient way to do things. Anyway, long story.
Sandro, did you have an opinion on that?
Maybe just as sort of I mean, I agree, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with non-hacking attacks. Also, we have portable EMP suitcases where you can just light a nice little EMP pulse if you're doing that close to a network node, which usually doesn't have a Faraday cage around it, and everything is gone as well permanently. So there's a lot of fun stuff you can do without having to hack anything. But just as sort of a closing idea, I think the question defending the core is wrong. So you have to, if you want to have cybersecurity, you have to defend it everywhere. We have to move away from this idea that there's one single central solution and I can put it to the telco and then everything is fine. Yeah. That's basically the whole firewall nonsense all over again. So I have this one technology, I put it here and everything is fine and I don't have to worry about the incredibly vulnerable this and the incredibly vulnerable that. It's just not true. So we have to move away from the idea that there is a core that we can defend and move to the idea that we have to defend everything, everywhere, all the time. And that's a nasty question, no, but it seems that that would be a more proper.
Just to be clear, defending the core
framing.
is not about solving everything, it's about solving a problem.
Yeah, but it's also this idea of having sort of a central mechanism in a central place where you can sort of scale security from, but security doesn't really scale that way.
Last words, because we're out of time.
I
Paul?
understand we're out of time, and my final comment will be that I agree, on the one hand, we can't do a hard, crunchy exterior and a soft, gooey interior. That won't work. So defending the core may be the wrong question, and you're certainly right that we're going to have to move to a defend everything approach, but what you left out is that we won't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm sorry we weren't able to have time for more questions, but you can find everyone out in the hallway, I'm sure. And thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to our great panelists, too. Thank you.